Hi, welcome everyone. I think we are going to get started. My name is Daniela Bleichmar. I am a professor of art history and history at USC, and I direct the Levan Institute for the Humanities. Do turn your camera on if you are able to. It is always nice to see who is joining us today. Today we are here for a book chat to discuss Joan Flores-Villalobos' new book, The Silver Women, How Black Women's Labor Made the Panama Canal, which came out from the University of Pennsylvania Press earlier this year. Joining us for this conversation are Sue-Ann Caulfield, who is professor of history at the University of Michigan, and Jessie Hoffnung-Garskov, who is professor of history at Harvard University. And the conversation will be moderated by our colleague at USC, Racel Salazar-Pareñas, who is professor of sociology and gender studies. Today's book chat is co-sponsored by the USC Van Honeck History Department and by the USC Center for Latinx and Latin American Studies. In terms of the format, it is very simple. Joan will first give very brief comments to introduce her book, and then she will respond to questions from Professors Caulfield and Hoffnung-Garskov, moderated by Professor Pareñas, and we will leave the last 20 minutes or so for questions from the audience. Thank you so much for joining us to celebrate Joan's new book. And so, Joan, tell us about it.
Hi, everybody. First, I just want to say thank you for coming, and I'm so excited to be here with y'all. Thank you, Daniela, for the invite, and Isabella for all the organizing. Thank you, Racel, for moderating. Your work on gender and labor and migration is so important to me. And it's such an honor to have Jessie and Sue-Ann here. I was telling Sue-Ann earlier that it's amazing to feel like I'm part of like a long genealogy of women's and gender history in Latin America, of which she is, you know, such a great representative. And again, with Jessie, to have somebody who works on the diaspora and like Afro-Caribbean migrations, and the both of you together is exactly what my book is all about. So it's really exciting to have you all here. So I'll say three brief things about my book. The first is that the book really started when I was on the ground in Panama and noticing the really vast gap in how official histories of the canal treated West Indian migration, right? So obviously the canal really dominates Panama, and especially tourist sites in Panama. So there are monuments to the canal everywhere. Everybody goes, the first stop is the Miraflores locks to see, you know, ships passing through the canal. And there's a big, big museum of canal history, none of which mention West Indian women at all whatsoever. And there's a really vast difference between that story and the one that's told in the really, really small local museum run by a volunteer West Indian Panamanian organization. It's called the West Indian Museum of Panama. It's not at all on like where all the other tourist sites in Panama City are, very rarely visited. And in that museum, instead, women are so present, right? Like the museum has women's quilts, photographs of women's clubs, a full-scale recreation of the veranda kitchens where women cooked during the construction because it was too much of a fire hazard to cook inside. And so I was really struck by how much the community remembered women being such a crucial part of the migration during the canal construction in a way that wasn't present in the official histories. And so is the case in books about the Panama Canal construction. So that's really where the work started. And again, this is something that I like to say that any West Indian knows this argument already. But really the central takeaway of my book is that West Indian women's labor of social reproduction, their domestic work, their care work, cooking, washing, cleaning, taking care of children, feeding workers was essential to the construction of the Panama Canal, right? And that thinking about their informal, uncontracted work on the edges of the construction actually helps us expand the social world that we understand really built the Panama Canal. The last thing I'll say, just because I think it's kind of an obvious question that comes up, is what does the title mean, right? The Silver Women. So the Panama Canal labor force was organized was organized by race and racially segregated. White American workers who were considered skilled workers were paid in gold, which was gold-backed American dollars, whereas Black West Indian workers were paid in silver, which were actually silver coin locally, which were Colombian pesos or Panamanian balboas. West Indian women actually didn't have to participate in the contracted labor force, right? They didn't receive official offers of labor from the Isthmian Canal Commission. So even though they were silver women in the sense that they were subject to the racial segregation that structured the labor force, they actually could kind of negotiate between the gold and silver role, both in terms of how they got paid, and also because gold and silver began to segregate all kind of social space in the canal. So that's where the book title comes from, thinking about how Black women really were able to skirt and negotiate these more structured forms of racial capitalism in Panama. So I will leave it there, and hopefully we'll have a great conversation about it.
Professor Flores-Villalobos, thank you very much. Now we are going to proceed with comments and questions from Professor Caulfield. You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry. So thank you. Thank you very much to the organizers of the event, as well as to Joan Flores-Villalobos for the opportunity to participate. It was really a pleasure to read this book. This book is a great read. There are moments that are really funny. There are moments that are very poignant. And there's a really rich and dense backdrop of analysis that is so interesting and so gratifying to read as someone who's been working in the field of gender history, and particularly on issues such as family and sexuality and honor. And so it was really wonderful to see this, sort of a new generation coming up and contextualizing what's a really new take on these issues and what's really, really new stories. As part of this long dialogue. So it was nice that Joanne also felt that this was something that she was aware of, that she was contributing to kind of a long kind of conversation about gender, sexuality, and honor in Latin America. So this analysis is really rich, maybe as rich as the lives of the protagonists of these stories, which are really forefronted in the book overall. And I was impressed particularly with the ways that Joanne captures both the West Indian women's really assertive self-presentation and their victories against forces that would rob them of their respectability and personhood. And yet the ways that she does this without losing track of the tremendous hardship that they endured. So without any romanticism of these protagonists. And the book is also in constant dialogue with an international, without being theory heavy. It's very constant dialogue with theories and literature on gender and empire. And at the same time, focusing on these women, individual women who made it possible for the United States to build the Panama Canal. And so the lives of these West Indian women are contextualized both in the local history of Panama and the zone. And I think she used the word zonians as people are living there, which is really interesting, as well as in this global history that saw the rise of US empire and the development of global capitalism. And so beginning with the introduction to the book, and my questions are organized sort of, they go along the different chapters of the book. So the first one is the framing of this backdrop, the sort of international global history of which this is a really central part, this episode of the Panama Canal. So my first question is about the conceptualization or the framework of racial capitalism that you talk about in the introduction and bring up in other parts of the book as well. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, describe how that framework helps you understand the stories that you uncover in the archives that you're looking at, the US and Panamanian archives. Should I keep going, or do you want to answer now?
Yeah, I think you should
jump in, or?
Yeah, you should keep going, and then we'll have Jessie speak, and then then Joanne can collectively then respond.
Oh, okay, great.
Yes.
So then moving through the first few chapters of the book explores gender arrangements and family lives that West Indian women created in the post-emancipation period, first on the islands before they got on boats and went over to Panama. And it shows how these women developed this fierce sense of autonomy and really well developed and long-standing strategies for survival, and how these clashed with the multiple layers of patriarchal authority that they encountered in the Canal Zone. And so among these amazing episodes is a scandal that's provoked by the arrival of Martinican women, a boatload of Martinican women whose passage was actually paid by the canal company because they recognized that they need these women, in order for their male workers to survive and to sort of run the local economy and care economy. But it was this was turned in by the press in the U.S. This was turned into the paid prostitution that the U.S. was sort of working as the canal company was working as a pimp and bringing these women. And it ended up, the end of this scandal was this amazing law to outlaw consensual unions, which seems really unthinkable elsewhere in Latin America. And so Joanne looks at how women responded to investigations into their honor, as well as how they responded to prosecutions because of this law, because it was illegal to live with someone without being legally married. So I have a couple of questions about this. And one is, what was this the last time? Did they not pay for passage of workers' family members? Because they continue to recognize that these women's labor was essential. And then regarding the marriage, you showed that really interestingly, because this is also counterintuitive in many ways, that it was women who seemed to really avoid marriage. But you don't talk so much in the book about whether men also avoided marriage and whether they did so for similar reasons. So, and then also because of course, marriage could also confine men, making them financially liable for their wives and for their children. So you showed how the women pressured authorities to accept their domestic arrangements, at least for some purposes. But I wondered also if your sources revealed men's attitude toward marriage and fatherhood, in similar ways as the women. And then finally, it was striking that although women did all kinds of work and were crucial suppliers of foodstuffs and services, their earning power was still only about half of that of the men's. And I wonder whether you find records of conflicts that makes it all the more interesting that they are still fiercely defending their autonomy vis-a-vis their male partners, because I wondered whether you found records that are, common pretty much everywhere, paternity suits and child support custody disputes, and other kinds of arguments over men's responsibilities to take care of wives and children. And then also, the last thing on the marriage law is, in terms of marriage law, the civil law tradition in Latin America was much more protective of women's property and inheritance than Anglo-American law, which gave husbands near total control and prerogative. And I wonder if there was any discussion of the terms of marriages that did happen in the Canal Zone. I assume these took place under Anglo-American law, but I also wondered whether there was any discussion of the different conceptions, or at least the different responsibilities and roles, duties and responsibilities in marriage in the two different traditions, the Anglo-American and the Latin American. And then another set of questions, and I'll end here. I've got a couple more sets of questions, but I'll just end. Well, why don't I just end here? I'm worried that I'm taking up too much time, and let Jessie go, and then I have another set of questions regarding chapters 5 and 6. Does that make sense, or should I keep going?
Whatever you're comfortable with.
Why don't I let Jessie jump in and then
Okay.
come back to me if there's time, or I can jump in if he has similar things to say about chapters 5 and 6.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Caulfield. Now we will hear from Professor Hoffman-Garskov.
Hi, thank you so much also for the invitation, and for it's been really exciting to read this book and to be looking forward to being a part of this conversation. I just want to, would you, Professor Flores, would you like to respond to those first questions, or do you want to keep piling up questions before jumping in?
I think I'll take a few more questions and then.
Oh, okay. I also really appreciated this book. I felt like very much like Sue-Ann, I felt like so many of the pieces here made so much sense based on what I have been reading over the years and what we've sort of been seeing various scholars piece together in arguments. And then there was so much creative work to find the evidence and to sift through it and make real sense of evidence, which, and I'll get to this in the questions, which wasn't necessarily always evidence about Black women's labor on the canal, but in building the canal, but rather evidence about all kinds of other things that were going on around it. And to try to have I really appreciate the way the book has this really clear and compelling central argument, but also takes the time to really think about all of the ramifications of the centrality of Black women's labor and the way that it actually plays out in a number of different terrains. So, just in terms of thinking about sort of what kinds of things to ask you so that folks who are in attendance but who haven't necessarily gotten a chance to read the book yet might get a little bit of sense of what I mean by this. For instance, I mean, we've already Sue-Ann already asked about the question about the episode of the Floridian, the steamship that came through, which really again highlights, and I would like to hear you speak a little bit around both the fact that in the official histories that are told in the museum in Panama City, which I've actually been to, and I completely agree with your analysis of, and also the simultaneous explanations of what was going on in as imperial actors are trying to build an infrastructure to build the canal, made Black women's labor invisible, while at the same time those imperial administrators were very conscious about their need to recruit Black women's labor, right? So that steamship really points this out, right? That they're actually subsidizing this labor. They're relying on it all the time. They're not seeking to solve problems of housing, of feeding male workers, and of other kinds of care work, of doing laundry for male workers. They're making conscious decisions not to provide that because they feel like they can rely on Black women, while at the same time making those Black women invisible and also targeting them for regulation and for enforcement of regulation that's oftentimes very hazardous to those women's lives. So in that vein, I thought it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about whether or not, in addition to the problematics of the accusation of trafficking, whether in fact you think that trafficking, the U.S. government was involved in trafficking women, not for both labor and for sex. They certainly were doing what I think in contemporary terms we would think of as labor trafficking of West Indian men, in terms of using migration and the vulnerabilities of migrancy to create exploitative and coercive work relationships. I also thought I would like to hear you talk a little bit about the ways in which some of the richest and most literally colorful sources that you have around Black women's labor are so problematic and so difficult to work with, right? So for those folks who haven't read the book, there's this wonderful chapter based on writings decades after the completion of the canal by some of the white women who went down as spouses of canal building white male Anglo-American professionals, and their recounting of their own role as women in this imperial space, as white women civilizing this imperial space, but their continued return to stories about their relationships with Black domestic help or with Black women entrepreneurs, as a really rich source for thinking about what kinds of labor were going on and how much white imperialism was dependent upon this labor, but also how tricky it can be to take those sources and work with them when the idea is to center the experiences and ideas of Black women who are really just cast as, oftentimes quite insultingly, as props in some of these stories. The last thing that I'll ask you about, so that number two would be sort of to think about as you were thinking about the sources that are centrally about labor, how complicated they can be to work with. And then the other thing would be to say that as I read this book, and I think Sue-Ann was getting at this too, it's a labor history, but it's also very much a very compelling and intertwined urban and legal history. And what I mean by that is that there's these kind of really two interesting legal regimes going on side by side. There's the legal regime of the canal zone, and there's a legal regime that we really learn about mostly in the immediate aftermath, the depopulation of the canal zone after the finish of the canal, which is next door. The Panamanian government is operating, and you have these urban configurations in which, from the very beginning, it seems like the policing of Black women's intimate relationships forces them out of the imperially governed canal zone and into urban spaces immediately proximate to it. And then, especially after the depopulation, it's clear that both the U.S. government through the Canal Commission and the Panamanian government through some very shady elite figures who both own land and profit from the creation of this urban space, but also are involved in governing it, decide that they're going to create a red light district in that proximate urban space that needs to be right next to the canal zone for their purposes, but not in it for their purposes, and also collude to settle Black women workers in that space, and then create legal categories that discipline and punish and disadvantage those Black women for living in spaces that are coded as sexualized. That seems to be a really interesting set of configurations that is both kind of these legal history arguments and also urban history arguments. And the question is, with folks who have not necessarily read the book yet, to ask you to spend a little bit of time reflecting on how you, in those sources, were able to find and make arguments about what, given their very limited space of maneuver, what Black women, West Indian workers were doing, and how they made use of the resources that were available to them in those urban spaces and in those legal regimes. And that will be the end of my question.
So thank you, Professor Hoffman Garskoff. So I'm like tempted to add to this, but I won't. So you have about like a maximum of 15 minutes, Professor Flores-Villalobos, to respond, and then we'll open it up to others in this cyber room.
Okay, I will try to take less than 15 minutes so we can keep hearing. I love hearing people's questions about my work, because then it's when you realize, like, oh, they got it. They got what I was trying to say. Okay, so first I'll answer the questions about racial capitalism and about sources, and then we'll go into some of the more specific ones. So the conceptualization of racial capitalism is totally central to the book, and it actually didn't come until much later in the process of me developing the book, but it was very helpful. And I think at the beginning, I kind of chafed against it because racial capitalism is a great way to think about the structure of labor on the canal zone for contracted labor. And I kept thinking, what is it that this is not telling me about women, right? And that's the problem I wanted to figure out. How does racial capitalism help me think about the space? But there's something about it that doesn't include the way women are working kind of outside the official contracted labor system. And that's really where I hope that my argument kind of intervenes, right? Thinking about how to add questions of gender and sexuality into a longer debate about racial capitalism that's, still very much alive in the field, that doesn't often take questions about women's labor seriously because they're not part of the contracted labor force that is so distinctly racialized, right? And I want to ask, what does it matter that women were coming as informal labor and were still a crucial part of this development, right? They essentially undergird this system that divides the labor force racially, while at the same time their labor is being disavowed, right? As both of you have pointed out. And as well, taking a lot of influence from scholars like Russell and many other people who work on care economies and social reproduction, who are already trying to rethink this kind of ultra focus on like capital and labor as the central relationship, when in fact there are all these other workers who are working alongside, but not any less important than central labor relationship, right? In terms of sources, this is another kind of major part of the work, and I try to make the conversation about archives and sources something that comes up repeatedly. because you know, two things. One is that when I first started the project, so many people told me you're not going to find anything about Black West Indian women in the archives, which I'm like, every historian has heard that tale before. It's like, you're just not going to find it. And of course I did. I found a lot of material, but so much of it was deeply painful to read, right? The memoirs that Jesse mentioned, which are these really famous memoirs written by white American women that get cited in almost every book that's been written about Panama Canal history, because they are really rich sources. I ordered them on interlibrary loan thinking, well, I have to read them because everybody cites them, but clearly they're about white women. I don't know what they'll say. And actually these books are so much. These white women were so obsessed with the Black women around them, right? Because those are the people they're interacting with on a day-to-day basis, the maids in their homes, the higglers who sell them food. And so I was so stunned by actually how much there was about Black West Indian women, but also by the fact that almost every single story was totally denigrating them, right? With actively, profoundly racist language. And so I wanted to think, what can I do with these sources that are actually like very numerous, but are clearly not at all, have no empathy for Black women whatsoever. And I didn't want to just cast them aside and say, well, that's not worthwhile at all, especially when so many of these stories, despite the fact that the speaker who is telling the story thinks so little of the Black women around them, even in those cases, you can see Black women kind of maneuvering for better labor relationships, better salaries, better situations for themselves and their families, right? And I wanted to kind of extract that from the sources and be really conscious of the way, you know, our archival power was framing the way women appeared in all of these. And that is kind of throughout the book, not just in these horrific but interesting memoirs. To some of the more specific questions. So, did the U.S. pay for the passage of other family members after the Floridian incident with the Martinican women? Not for Black West Indians. They did so for white American women. And actually, they spent quite a bit of money and time trying to develop big social life for white American families. And you can see in the work that comes later, right? So how Zonians, which is what they call themselves, so people who were born and live in the Canal Zone call themselves Zonians. They have like really amazing, nostalgic, positive memories of the Canal Zone and how much they call it a socialist paradise because everything was provided for them. That just did not happen for Black West Indians after this episode. And in fact, the Canal Commission stops building married housing for West Indians altogether, right? So they're just not encouraging that work at all. Did West Indian men also avoid legal marriage the way West Indian women did? Yes, absolutely. This was common practice in the islands. Men were traveling to the zone by themselves. And there are a lot of sources that show men leaving West Indian women behind to go migrate to other places for labor all the time. But it's only West Indian women who face surveillance for being single, right? Or for being unmarried or for cohabitating without legal marriage. The fact that men are or aren't doing that is not really relevant to the Canal Commission as long as they're working, right? Whereas women are seen as the kind of site where the problem lies, the moral problem lies. Women, so the thing about women still making less than men's salaries. One thing I'll note about that is that it's a little hard to know exactly how much women were making, especially somebody like a higgler, where you really have no idea what their monthly income was. And I don't know that it was likely that they didn't make as much as men's salaries because they were being paid by the US. But I do also think they probably made more than we think. And that is just not a well-recorded part of how that, how their labor worked in that space, because really the only salaries we have a pretty good sense of are women who were domestic servants in white American homes, which doesn't really tell us the story of the women who were doing kind of entrepreneurial labor more broadly. Nevertheless, we do see sources where women fight over things like child support, right? And I have, so for example, I have one really interesting source where a woman goes to her partner's boss and writes him his boss being a white American, and writes the boss a letter asking for him to intercede with her partner or husband, they weren't legally married, to force him to pay her child support, right? So they're definitely mobilizing all these different tactics to be able to access some of that salary. And in terms of legal marriages and their distinction between kind of Anglo and Latin American law, you know, part of what's interesting with that, I have lots of examples of how they're functioning under Anglo law, because people got married within the Canal Zone and then would seek divorce within the Canal Zone, and I have sources of that. I really didn't find equivalent sources in Panama, right? So there was no sense, at least during that period, of whether people were seeking, but divorce wasn't legal in Panama until after the construction. So there wouldn't have been that sort of thing. And at the same time, if people were seeking divorce, they might just go to the Canal Zone to do it. So they wouldn't necessarily be looking to access it through Panamanian law. Instead, what you find is people negotiating the kind of everyday conflicts and potential violence of marriage and partnerships, even when they're not legally married, right, through these local neighborhood courts, the corregidorias, where they often, you know, say my husband is abusing me, like they wouldn't ask for divorce necessarily, right? But they'd ask for some sanction to make sure that he would stop. So in that, you can see the difference. But again, Panama didn't legalize divorce until much later than the Canal Zone. Was the U.S. involved in trafficking women for sex and labor? I mean, other than that incident with the Floridian, there is no other obvious moment when that happened. But then again, we have to think, I mean, just like you said, right, they know that they need that work even while they're disavowing it. So even if they weren't actively going to the islands and forcing people to sign these, you know, really unequal contracts like they did with men, they are in some ways turning a blind eye to the fact that that work is there and that they rely on it. So, right, I guess I don't know where exactly that line lies, but they were certainly aware of it. And part of and this is an answer also to Sian's question about whether they ever paid for more passage of family members. They don't pay for women to migrate again after the Floridian incident, but they invest in what they say is supposedly kind of better institutions to serve their labor force, right? But as they do that, they also begin to neglect the silver workforce more and more, knowing that women will pick up the slack, right? So they stop building married housing. They don't bring in foods that are commonly eaten in the West Indies to feed the workers, right? So they say that they don't need that labor because they're improving at providing these services for the labor force, even as they're kind of actively, let's say, defunding the silver roll services. And then now I don't quite remember what this question about the kind of two legal regimes of the Canal Zone and Panama quite was, which you can remind me, Desi, again. But I'll just say one thing that it made me think of, which is that I was having a conversation with a Panamanian journalist this morning and telling her about the way that kind of women navigated between these two spaces, and how much of what they did was that, you know, they could escape the surveillance of the Canal Zone by, and I said to her, crossing the border to Panama. And she laughed at me and said, that's so funny, because of course now that's all Panamanian territory. And she was like, I really can't think of it as a border at all. And I was like, you know what, that's actually helpful, because they didn't either, right? There wasn't really a kind of marked line. They didn't have to show a passport to cross. Those places did exist under separate sovereignties, so they weren't as beholden to US law when on Panamanian territory, which they knew and used to their purposes. But in some ways, they also saw the border as a totally porous space, right, that they could use to their benefit.
So the question was, given that these two legal spaces exist, and that the spaces, you know, it's very clear that they target and seek to control and to criminalize, as well as feminizing and racializing spaces to criminalize the people who live in those spaces. What's remarkable about your work is that in each of those chapters, focusing on those two legal regimes, you find ways to really identify what kinds of uses the women that are the center of your study make use, how they make use of, crazy, these crazy legal regimes, which are not obviously designed for their benefit. And so the idea was like, maybe tell us a little bit about the kinds of cases that women bring or claims that they make in the imperial court system and the kinds that they make in the Panamanian, the local Panamanian civil court system or criminal court system. And are they the same? Are they similar? Are they slightly different because of the different contexts?
Yeah, and I think the marriage was a good example, right? Within the Canal Zone, they can apply, the people who are legally married can apply for divorce in a way that in Panama doesn't exist. So people use this different legal regime in Panama where they don't have access to the formal court system because that's only for Panamanians, but they do have access to the kind of local justices of the peace where they then make claims both about their husbands and daily abuse, about partners who maybe steal money from them, or about kind of everyday encounters and fights with their neighbors who are other West Indian women who they see as kind of intruding into their personal space or intruding into their kind of market sector if they're both doing the same kind of work. So you really see a much deeper kind of slice of life, neighborhood level interactions on the Panama side in a way that is not present on the US side, because the people who would have access to the Canal Zone courts were a much more limited group, right? You had to have some sort of connection to the Canal Commission or be actively living in the Canal Zone, which most West Indian women did not. But part of what you find within the Canal Zone then is that women also look for ways around the legal system, right? Because the courts, of course, are there, but there are other major authorities in the Canal Zone that can also provide them relief. So, for example, women would petition the chief engineer of the Canal Zone, George Goethals, who ran a kind of informal court that everybody knew. Everybody knew he ran it in the Canal Zone. It was held every Sunday morning, where he just, even though he didn't have strict legal power under the US, he just did it. Everybody called him a benevolent despot. And so women would sometimes go to these courts and try to get intercession from him there, or they would contact individual bosses, right? So it's not only with the kind of formal legal system, but also other sites of authority and power within the Canal Zone.
Okay, so thank you very much to those comments and the responses. So now we would like to open it up to the rest of the audience, if you have any questions. Okay, yes, Christine Hunfeld, please.
Yes, well, Joan, thank you so much for a wonderful contribution of our reading of daily lives of women. And talking about daily lives, I think that what you are uncovering is what we usually call the social reproduction of labor, no? That was on site in the Panama Canal. And in more general terms, I have two comments and a question. Maybe you can help me find answers to. It's about the general recruitment strategies that were used, no? Differentiating, of course, by race and gender. So if you would summarize what the recruitment strategies were. And I think that there's also, I mean, the Panama Canal was an event that took 10 years to build. And in 10 years, a lot of changes happened within the processes that you described. And one important change in this context is World War I. No? I mean, what happens to gender relations in the United States? We know pretty well that men were sent abroad, no, to fight the war, and then women were inserted into industrial endeavors in the United States. Was there any effect on the same lines when in the construction of the Panama Canal? And then the other component that I'm missing from the comments, I haven't read the book yet, but I'm looking forward to read it, of course, is the role of the indigenous people. I mean, Panama was inhabited by Kuna Indians, right? And Kuna Indians and the upheaval against Colombia authority was one of the reasons why Panama was split apart from Colombia. No? So I was wondering, what happened in the whole process of the construction of the Panama Canal with the original indigenous people, no? Is there any information about that in the wake? And the last thing I want to pick up, I mean, we're talking about a whole labor force, about 56,000 people, right? And of those 56,000 people, about 10% died, mainly from disease, but also from accidents. And so I would like to see your comment about how these 56 people were divided racially and in terms of gender. I mean, how many were men, how many were women, how many were Black, how many were Indians, how many were white? I don't know if there's any answer to that more statistical question and to the general macroeconomic context. Thank you so much, Joan. I very much like listening to all the comments and your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. And actually, about that last question about the deaths, maybe I'll answer the other questions and then maybe see, Sue-Ann, you said you kind of had a question about chapter 5, which is maybe about that. So maybe we kind of bring it back to you and have a conversation about that. But let me answer some of your other questions first. So the first thing about the social reproduction of labor, that's a central concept in the book. And one thing I'll point out, which I haven't mentioned here, is that, of course, I'm deeply interested in the social reproduction of labor for, the construction of the Panama Canal. But I am as interested, and the book pays as much attention, I hope, to the social reproduction of the West Indian community as itself, right? West Indian women were important to the Panama Canal, but they were also important to West Indian life and survival in a way that far exceeded the construction of the canal, right? And that wasn't kind of beholden to the needs and desires of capital and empire. In terms of recruitment strategies, honestly, word of mouth was the #1 recruitment strategy they used and needed. The amount of money that the canal was paying was spread like wildfire, right, in the Caribbean. And so everybody heard about it. They did, of course, put ads in all the newspapers, which you can see. And in certain islands, especially Barbados, which was the central recruitment site, they had actual recruitment offices where there was an agent that went out and gave contracts to people. They had recruitment offices also in Martinique, and then one other island that is now escaping me, although eventually they shut those down. The Barbados one was there for almost the entire construction. One of the places that didn't have a recruitment office, notably, was Jamaica, because Jamaica didn't allow formal recruitment. But Jamaicans already had a kind of long-standing relationship with Panama. It's far closer than the Lesser Antilles. And so Jamaicans actually heard about it because there was already so much interaction between the island and the mainland at the time, right? And Jamaicans, there was already a community of Jamaicans who lived in Panama, right? Who could tell their friends, tell their kin about it. So again, word of mouth was so powerful. World War I. It did mark a distinct change. I don't really touch on it in the book because World War I starts the moment the canal is finished and inaugurated, right? Which is about where I finished the book. Rena Goldthry and Keisha Cornaldi are 2 historians who kind of follow that story in the aftermath of World War I. But one thing I'll point out is that there wasn't the same sort of dynamic that happens in the US in that men leave to fight and then women take on industrial labor, partly because once the canal construction is finished, the amount of employment that is available for West Indian drastically reduces, right? And the Canal Commission, in fact, kicks out everyone who isn't a white American from the canal zone officially. And so what most West Indians choose to do, though some stay in Panama, most choose to just migrate other places. And so you find West Indian labor migrating to places like Cuba, where there's a huge sugar industry boom, to other places that United Fruit Company, where United Fruit Company is, like Honduras, Costa Rica, and then to places like New York, where they also find all different forms of labor and kind of feed what becomes the Harlem Renaissance, right? So there is a distinct change once World War I starts. And some West Indians, of course, do in fact leave to fight in the war for Britain, but not exactly in the same way that it happens in the US. In terms of indigenous people, both the Cunayala and the Emberá people of Panama essentially worked out these distinct legal agreements with the state where they have sovereign territory in specific parts of Panama, right? So the Cunayala specifically have a really distinct archipelago of islands far north of where the Panama Canal Zone is, as same as the Embera. And so they're not necessarily geographically located in the same space that the canal zone, where the canal zone resides. I didn't see any sources of the interaction between Black West Indians and indigenous Panamanians, which doesn't mean it didn't happen, but rather that the US and Panama are not reading the interactions as such, right? Part of it is because Panama only understand as indigenous the people who are living in the specific territories that are marked as indigenous, right? They're not seeing everyday people who might be of indigenous descent. They're not reading them as indigenous. You see what I mean? Whereas the US could not care less about who is indigenous or not, right? They're like, Panamanians are natives and West Indians are Black labor, and that's it, right? Their categories are a much more simplistic read of what is on the ground in Panama, right? So that's part of what is difficult about figuring out that dynamic. And then lastly, in terms of census stats, that's always a difficult question when thinking specifically about women. The number of like 40, 50, 60,000, that's the official labor force. The unofficial amount of migrants who came to Panama is much closer to 150,000. And so we know very well what the US Census says about the people who came to the Panama Canal Zone, but that's only about a third of the reality of the people who actually came to Panama and the Canal Zone within that period, right? Which was loosely 80% from the British and French West Indies, right? And then the rest were Americans, Greeks, Spaniards, and Chinese labor in much, much smaller amounts. And then within that group that was West Indian, officially, the group of Black West Indian women hovered around the 9,000 range. Unofficially, it would have been much, much vaster, but they're not being counted when they enter directly through Panama because Panama doesn't have a kind of bureaucratic immigration apparatus to count entries.
Okay, okay, thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left. So perhaps we can get at least 2 sets of questions for Professor Flores-Villalobos to engage. As people are thinking, I have a question. And so I think that this book, which I really enjoyed reading, has tremendous implications for advancing gender and migration studies. And this is actually something we haven't talked about yet in this hour. And so in particular, it's pushing against first this sort of common knowledge in migration studies, which is often based on US experiences, that women did not migrate independently, that they were like secondary migrants. And this really pushes against that. And so I wanted you to say a little bit more about that. And then secondly, is you see then people's multi-step migration that, we haven't really documented so well in gender and migration studies. Many of the people who are writing in this multi-step migrations are talking about it in the contemporary period. So this is, again, something new in this book. And then third, this is not about gender, but what really struck me and something that I wasn't familiar with was their continued migration then of some to the US and, the implications to the accumulation of Black wealth, which sort of parallels discussions today about how many of the successful Blacks are coming from immigrant backgrounds and that the legacy of slavery still really, diminishes opportunities, for, African Americans. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that too. But are there other questions that people in the audience want to add?
Well, also, I know Sue Ann had another question. So do you maybe want to add something, Sue Ann, and then I'll answer.
Sure. I'll throw out, I have a couple, but the first is about chapter 5. And that was a very poignant chapter, the ways that these men, particularly women too, but especially men, are dying in such great numbers. And it's really terrible ways, and people back home are getting word and trying to respect the remains in Panama, as well as trying to get their property back. And I wondered how difficult it was for common law spouses, for their partners, to get their property, not only the wages in back pay that you mentioned in several cases, but also the property they might have shared, some of which might have been in his name, which is always a problem, or very frequently a problem, for people who live consensually without formal marriage. And so that was one question, whether it was possible for the women to make those claims. And the other was about chapters 6 and 7, which were my favorite chapters, loved those chapters, about the ways that women's self-presentation, both their sartorial self-presentation that's very extravagant and bold and expressive, and also matched by their vocal self-presentation. You talk about the very colorful and very emphatic ways that they publicly defend their right to respect by peers, by people that are living with them, and also before the court system in Panama. And so my question about that was, this is similar to other studies of West Indian women and insults cases, and how West Indian cases really contrast with insults cases from other parts of mainland Latin America, in precisely for the reasons that you cite as this sort of alternative script for how to defend and for how to assert, really, not even, defend and assert one's respectability and demand respect for one's presence in public. And it seems that this is an element of sort of a generalized West Indian culture, and you talk about that. But I wondered also whether the canal situation, how the canal situation made that different than from what, for example, Laura Putnam finds in Costa Rica, or for the kinds of discussions about Black women's self-expression in the United States, or Black Panamanian women, for that matter, in Panama.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for all these questions. Yes, my work is so wedded to kind of getting rid of that idea of women being secondary to this migration. And I thought it was so important to talk about it in this context, because they are, in fact, demographically a much smaller wave than the men, which I think has been taken by historians to mean that they were less important. And I wanted to kind of fight against that, not only kind of theoretically, but even demographically, right? That we've misunderstood what those demographics mean, because we don't actually have a good sense of how many women were actually there. The question about immigrant wealth, Rosella, it's like you've read my mind. I'm obsessed with this question. And in fact, I think it comes out this month. I just published an article. It's called Thrift, Morality, and Migration at the Barbados Savings Bank. It just came out in History Workshop Journal. And it's because I've become obsessed with this question, and I wanted to think about, wealth accumulation, partly because I have my grad student who is here in this Zoom. In one of my grad class, were one of the last people who read my manuscript. And this wonderful grad student asked me if I wasn't just making the argument that these women were like good little capitalists. I was like, no, but there is something to that, right? Like, there is a story I'm telling here about immigrants who make money and then go to New York and then buy a brownstone, and then their offspring become kind of a middle class, a West Indian middle class in New York, right? So I wanted to kind of dive into that question, and I traced some of the way that women specifically in that article, traced some of the way that women specifically were essentially the financial managers of their family, and how that does in fact help them settle in New York. But what is important to me about that in terms of thinking about that debate of whether, immigrants are kind of better able to manage the racial oppression that Black people live in America, right, is that it's not that they're coming with this incredible benefit. They're just coming from a situation where the particular racial oppression they faced was different, right? They're coming from a colonial context where they're also being attacked for their morality. They're also being attacked for not being proper colonial subjects who don't know how to save money and how to accumulate wealth. So that's just a story that's happening differently in the islands that then kind of interconnects with how people engage with the US. But anyways, there's much more about that in the article that I'm also really interested in this question. And I've had people ask me specifically about, for example, the West Indian women who own boarding houses, who were, you know, essentially business owners in a way that a woman who was a laundress never could have been, right? Which I'm also interested in kind of exploring further later. Were common law spouses able to get property? So this is a question of what system they're going through, right? If they are asking for the property that their husbands left on, or their partners rather, left on the canal zone, especially through the British colonial authorities, they often would get it as long as people paid attention. I mean, the biggest problem was indifference to their requests, not necessarily legal barriers. However, what common law spouses couldn't access was benefits that the US developed kind of halfway through the construction, where they gave if somebody had an accident or an accidental death on the canal zone, they would then receive a payout from the Canal Commission. Common law spouses did not have access to that. The US did put a kind of very distinct legal limit that only legal spouses could access it, although common law spouses could request that money if they were the legal parent to a child that the man who had died, you know, had kind of accepted. So it depends on who they were asking and what they were asking for, right? British colonial governments were a little bit less interested in policing that than the US was. And then lastly, the self-presentation question and its connection to work like Laura Putnam. Laura Putnam is, you know, one of the biggest influences on this work. Of course, anybody who reads that chapter 6 is like, this is Laura Putnam on the page, whom I, you know, really adore and has been such a big influence. I think the two big differences in this context are, one, you know, Laura was a little bit less interested in the kind of, in that particular book, with the repercussions it has in the work of the Black diaspora. And part of what's interesting to me is that these conversations about morality and honor and what it means on the ground for West Indian women become such a big part of the discussion among, for example, the Garveyist movement and Pan-Africanist movements, right? Who become really kind of totally obsessed with respectability and particularly Black women's morality as a site to police for the kind of growing Black intellectual middle class and how they see kind of the formation of the respectable Black diaspora. The second thing that is really key is that unlike in places like Costa Rica, where they're working with United Fruit and living in these kind of enclaves, in Panama, the West Indian migrants are seen by Panamanians as a kind of enemy of the state. They are seen as a kind of invasion force by the US.
Sorry to interrupt, but we are at the end of the hour.
Okay.
So we unfortunately have to end. But this is obviously a very engrossing discussion, and I hope that everyone purchases the book available from University of Pennsylvania Press. So thank you so much and congratulations.
I'm so sorry we ran out of time, Joanne. Your book, I have a question, but I'll get to ask it at some other point. My thanks to Sue-Ann Caulfield, Jesse Hoffnung-Garskov, and Russell Perennius for this exchange. And of course, the biggest thank you to Joanne for writing the book that brought us all together. Many congratulations. Thank you all for joining us. This is our last book chat of the year, but we hope to see you in the fall when we have a new array of book chats to celebrate the publications by USC colleagues. Have a wonderful summer. Thank you, Joanne. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Congratulations and thank you.